Last year, a beloved member of this congregation, Miguel Mendez, passed away. And Miguel was a professor of law at Stanford, but he also had a really deep heart of faith and commitment to Jesus Christ. And after he died, we thought of having an annual lecture series here at the church to honor his legacy of the intersection of faith, justice, and connecting that to following Jesus. And so this is going to be the first of our annual Miguel Mendez lectures, and we're really excited to have Professor Ra here today. And yep. And so I'll let Mary introduce Professor Ra now.
So welcome. Dr. Soong-Chan Ra, we were learning from him approximately 4 years ago. Kurt and I and several staff and leaders from this church, every year we send a team to go to Grand Rapids, Michigan to the Worship Symposium. And Soong-Chan was a part of many of the seminars and I think even plenaries that were helping us address the topic of lament and the neglect of lament and how that not only impacts the church, but our country. And that was very, very powerful for us. And the more we heard, the more we looked into his books. And we started reading his books, and we actually were sharing excerpts and video clips with our leaders, with our small groups, our officers. And so we finally decided, Kurt and I thought, what a great thing to actually have a Lenten series on lamentation. And so lamentations. So we plunged into that this Lent, and that has been a very eye-opening and challenging series to be in. But we thought how great it would be to have Soong-Chan come and to conclude the series, and also to speak to us out of the themes, topics from his book, Prophetic Lament, which is the book we have resourced the most. So a couple of reasons we're excited to have him here. First of all is just who he is, and I think he's a real prophetic leader for the church in this country. He has been dubbed that and also included in books, including the recent one on the new evangelicalism, or do I have that in front of me? Anyway, so he just has something to say to the church that I think is profound and important for us today. We as a congregation have named one of our strategic priorities as engaging issues of injustice. And we thought, what a great person to have come and feed us and teach us as we're in the middle of figuring out what that means as a church here and as the larger church. A few things you might want to know about Soong-Chan. He is in the ministry of fathering 2 teenage children, high school students, a son and a daughter. Married, lives in the Chicago area. His journey has been fascinating, and there's a lot more I want to ask him about this. From growing up Southern Baptist, now he's Evangelical Covenant. And along the way, he has gotten doctorates in theology from Luke, doctorate in ministry from Gordon Conwell Seminary. He's now a teacher, professor of church growth, evangelism at North Park Seminary in Chicago. Some of the chapters I didn't know about, though, is that he was doing some new church plants close to where I grew up in Maryland, outside of D.C. He served as a pastor, most of this in the Northeast, in Massachusetts, in the Boston, Massachusetts area, and was the campus pastor at MIT. Now, how fascinating would that be? So anyway, I want you to join me in welcoming Dr. Soong-Chan Ra.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, I'm just greatly honored to be with you all this weekend. Thank you for the very kind invitation. Thank you for being here on I guess I was supposed to say a beautiful California day, but it's not. This is like the first time I've been in California where it's actually rained, so this is pretty interesting. Thank you for making time for our conversation this afternoon. We're going to try to break this up into 3 parts, and in the first hour, we're going to talk about the context of the questions that we're asking. And the second part, we're going to talk about some of the theology, and then in the third portion, we're going to talk about methods of confrontation, or what we can do to move towards working through some of the injustices that we're encountering. So in each section, I'm going to give about a 35-minute presentation. I am always more ambitious in terms of my PowerPoint, so I'm going to have about 50 PowerPoints up here. We're going to get through about 10 of them, just to give you a fair warning. If you would like a copy of the PowerPoints, if that's okay, you can contact Kurt, and he will forward them to you. There will be a lot more references on certain things that I will not be able to get to, but it'll give you some starting points for further conversation and further study if you would like. So let's talk about what we're going to cover today. If you can go to the next slide. I'm going to use a method that's been spoken of by Holland and Henrio. If we go to the second slide. Holland and Henrio are Catholic priests, theologians who are teaching at Chicago Theological Union in Chicago, Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. And they wrote a book called Social Analysis, and they were trying to understand ways that the church could engage in works of justice. How do churches get connected to works of justice? And they propose, and this is actually modified a bit by the work of Eldon Villafañe, who is one of my former teachers at Gordon Conwell. He modified it just a bit, so I'm going to use his paradigm, but the source material is originally out of Holland and Henrio's work. But they talk about three different categories of engagement. The first is clarification. And this is the work of trying to understand the context in where our ministry occurs. So whenever we go into a community, when we go into a neighborhood, we can't just assume that one neighborhood is the same as the other, or that one community is the same as the other. Obviously, the makeup of the community is different, the socioeconomic, ethnic, racial, cultural, historical. There are so many different elements that change from neighborhood to neighborhood, city to city, that, for example, San Francisco is very different from Oakland, and Oakland is very different from Chicago, and Chicago is very different from New York. So these kind of differences are what we need to unpack. And this is that first step of clarification. What is the historical, social, cultural realities that inform our understanding of these communities? And before we start approaching the work of justice in these communities, we have to understand that social context. So the first step and our first hour will focus on the process of clarification. The second hour and the second step is conceptualization. And the key word here, of course, is concepts, meaning what are the biblical theological concepts? What is our theology? What is our biblical understanding that helps us to understand the context? So if the first step is clarification of the context, the second is the concepts, the theological biblical concepts that speak to our context. And then in the third hour, we're going to take a look at confrontation or methods of confrontation, as in now what do we do about it? We know the neighborhood we live in, we know the community we live in, we know the context in which we live in. How then do we apply these theological concepts, these theological ideas into that context through practical ways? What I've learned as being a now professor at seminary for about 11 years is that most people jump to that third step, right? We want to know, how do we fix the problem? But we got to know what the problem is, and we got to know what the Bible says about the problem before we say we're going to fix the problem. So we are going to get to that third section, but I want us to understand how important it is to get through the first two sections as well. Understand the context, understand what Scripture speaks to in that context, and then out of that begin to develop a very practical approach to ministry for that particular context. So if we look at the next slide, we'll see the way that this works is a circle. Eldon Villafañe, again, kind of sees this as a circular process, mainly because the context keeps changing. So even if you go through this cycle, you realize after going through the cycle, even after you've done the work of confrontation, that the context continues to evolve and change. Neighborhoods change, communities change, cities change, churches change, and therefore you also need to re-enter into that clarification process. It again operates in a circular fashion. But let's talk about the work of clarification in the next slide. And I'm going to give you a snapshot of this. Obviously, I can't give you a comprehensive picture of what your neighborhood is like. You know best what your neighborhood is like. And what I try to do in my work is actually give a larger picture of what's going on, because the specificity of your neighborhood is not something I can do for you because that's the neighborhood you live in. But what I can give are the sweeping, larger, broad brush strokes of what I see as what's happening in the larger American culture in particular. If there are certain things that don't quite apply to your immediate context, My apologies, but the main thing there is to try to get a larger scope of what is happening in our culture around some of these issues of injustice. So we're going to talk about the formation of this context, how these cultural dynamics, social dynamics, historical realities come to pass, and then hopefully you'll take some of those ideas and concepts and see if you can apply that to your particular context. I'm drawing this work, if you go to the next slide, from the work of Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman. Peter Berger was a sociologist and a sociology professor at Boston University for many years. He passed away about a year ago, I think, maybe about 6 months ago. Berger and Luckman is a German theologian / sociologist. Berger and Luckman wrote a book called The Social Construction of Reality. And Peter Berger is a very interesting person. It's always good to know the person behind the ideas at times. Peter Berger is a very interesting person because he's a Christian writing in the area of sociology and social theology. And he's writing right around the time that a different school down the street, he's at Boston University, another school down the street, Harvard University, some of the philosophers and theologians there are beginning to form the God is Dead movement out of Harvard University. One of my former professors, Harvey Cox, was actually a key member of that kind of movement within Harvard University. But they were believing in that context of Harvard Divinity School and Harvard University that humanity had gotten past God, that God was almost not needed anymore. So God is dead because human beings have moved into this progress to the point that God is unnecessary and God is not needed. And Berger is the person that comes along and responds to this Harvard School of Thought that leads to the God is Dead movement. And the way Berger actually puts out the need for God is by recognizing how broken the world is. So part of the Harvard School of Thinking was the world is becoming a better place. The cities are becoming good, and the world is progressing in a very positive direction. We don't need God anymore because human beings are on this inevitable march of progress. But what Berger does to respond to that God is Dead movement is to say, actually, no, we need God because the world is so broken, because the world is actually not as moving forward as we hoped it would. And so Berger and Luckman write about this process of how these social systems get formed and describe these social systems as broken, fallen systems. I'm using biblical language. Berger uses more of the sociological language. And he lists 3 different variables as well. He says there is the process of externalization, there's the process of objectification and institutionalization, and then the third process of internalization. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but let's talk about that first process. Go to the next slide of externalization. How do social systems, broken systems, social reality, how does cultural reality get formed? One of the steps is externalization. And the way we understand this is that we as individuals come with certain values, come with a worldview, come with certain realities, a history and a social reality. We come together in a church or in a school system or in a civic group or as a government or as a civic society, and each one of us as individuals with agency externalize our values, our ideals, our identity into that social system. So one of the ways social systems get formed is when individuals gather together and individuals externalize who they are into the system. This is very much recognizable in Western society, especially American society, which views the value of the individual contribution to society. How is society formed? With individuals contributing to that society. So this first step acknowledges that and say one of the most important factors of changing or contributing or forming social systems and social reality is when individuals externalize their individual identity into the culture and into society. But there's another step that we can't overlook because it's not just about the individual. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that the next step is objectification or institutionalization. That when a group of people get together and everybody is externalizing their value system into that social reality, at some point, Berger and Luckman argue, that institution begins to take on a life of its own, separate and distinct from even the individuals that helped to form and found that system. It's institutionalization, as in the institution now has an identity, a life, even a force, and even kind of an intelligence that is beyond those that originally started it. Let me give you the comparison from my personal experience. I was a church planter in the Cambridge, Massachusetts, Boston area for 10 years. And when I first started the church, I got a small group together. About 7 or 8 of us would meet in my apartment for about 6 months. And what we would do in the 6 months preparing to launch the church is that each of us would externalize, that first step, our vision of what a church can be. And it was coming from many of our experiences. And these individuals that gathered together would say things like, I grew up in a church that didn't have any engagement with social justice. And I would really like to see a church that does that. I grew up in a church that really did more contemporary worship. I would like to see that as part of a church that I'm involved in. I grew up in a church that didn't have a good community, and I would really like to see a good community around this church. So each of us, 6 or 7 of us, over a period of time, began to externalize this individual experience into the social system. So that's how the church was originally founded. Now, as the founding pastor, my externalization probably was the most significant or most noticeable. But after a period of time, we did start the church. We did have an institution that started that was a church plant. And even after a few years, the individuals that helped to start the church, many of them moved on. We were in a very transient community, a lot of students, graduate students. Boston, some of you know, is a very transient community. Many of them, after they graduated graduate school, would go to another part of the country. Some of them over here, some of them in Chicago, New York. So the individuals who had externalized the value system early on, many of them moved on. But the institution continued. And not only did the institution continue, it had moved beyond the individuals that helped shape that system in the first place. And now this institutionalization of a value system begins to take place within the church plant. So the church plant now has a life of its own that has outlived the contributions of the founders and now has a culture of its own that has its own identity. The third step is the process of internalization. And this is when an institution not only has a life of its own, but it begins to shape those who start coming into that system. So once we established that church plant, we developed a value and identity within that church so that when newcomers started coming into the church, the value system of that institution of the church begins to shape the newcomers who are now a part of the church. So it goes full circle. As you go to the next slide, you'll see how this kind of operates again. It operates in a full circle where the externalization leads to the formation of an institution. But now, go to the next slide. Now we see the institution operating in impacting and shaping the individual within that system. Now, this is a lot of sociological speak, but here's the takeaway message from what Berger and Luckman are writing about. And that is, if we want to change social systems, we cannot just operate on the assumption that it takes one good individual to fix a broken system, right? That's a pretty common fallacy, especially among Christian circles, that if we just get one good person into government, that person will save the system. If we just get one good guy with a gun, we will save the system from ever experiencing harm ever again. So we believe in Western culture in a very high value of the individual, the good individual who can reshape the system. Now, that's true to some extent because of the externalization that is occurring in the social system. But if we don't acknowledge not just the externalization piece, but also recognize the institutionalization and the internalization piece, we are not going to be changing the system will end up changing us. Right? So we keep thinking, just get that one good guy into government and that would change the system. Repeatedly we've seen that's not usually the case. The system will oftentimes take over the individual within that system. And because of the process of internalization, we will end up internalizing the negative values of that system rather than maybe changing that system towards good values. Our image of changing the world is kind of the whole Mr. Smith goes to Washington paradigm, right? The good, pure-hearted person goes to Washington, D.C. and changes the corrupt system. But what usually happens? That initially good-hearted person gets sucked up into the institution, and they start valuing the institution, and they start living out the values of that institution, self-preservation, etc., more so than the values that got them there in the first place. So what it points to is that injustice doesn't just operate on the individual level. It's not just the individual going in, externalizing justice in the face of injustice. You have to also address the reality of injustice in the system itself, not just the individuals that make up that system. All right, so this is pointing towards, and what I write about in my first book, that American society tends to view social problems purely through an individual lens. How do we change the world? With good individuals. How do we change our systems? With good individuals. What Berger and Luckman are pointing out is the reality that even if you have good individuals trying to change the system is powerful enough to suppress these good individuals and end up actually changing this individual more than actually changing the system. So what we're beginning to see is the difficulty of understanding how society changes. So if we're taking this paradigm that Berger and Luckman offer, we have to understand that we have to address evil and sin in its proper context. The next slide talks about the work of Stephen Mott, a Methodist professor. He was one of my faculty mentors at Gordon Conwell. And in his book, it was written about 30 years ago, but it's a brilliant work that still makes a lot of application today. He points out that this individualism of American society is not how evil operates. Evil operates not just in the individual sins of the person, but evil operates on a social, structural, systemic evil. And therefore, if you want to confront injustice, you can't just operate on the individual level. You have to, what he calls, understand the geography of evil. And you meet evil and sin in its proper geography. And if you're only meeting the sin on the individual level, then you are ignoring the reality, the social reality of sin and evil on that corporate level, that systemic, structural level. And so when we talk about how do we address injustice in the world, yes, there is an aspect of the individual externalizing the good into that broken world, but there's also the aspect of we need to confront evil in its proper geography, not just in the individual, but also in a system and an institution that has evil within those structures. If you look at the scriptures, we see this when the New Testament testifies, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the powers and the principalities, right? So notice the difference. If you talk about sin is only in flesh and blood, it's only in the individuals that are doing bad things. But that's not what the apostle says. The apostle Paul says it's not just against flesh and blood, it is also against spiritual powers and principalities, and they are operating not only in the individual, they are operating within the system. Now I'm going to make a confession. I'm not Presbyterian. I do have Baptist background, but I also have Pentecostal background. So I'm going to make that confession up front. If you want to dismiss me for that, go ahead. But I have Pentecostal background. In fact, my Baptist church was charismatic. So I'm one of the very few Baptists who has both charismatic and Baptist background as well. One of the things I remember growing up in a Pentecostal charismatic gathering is that we did a lot of exorcisms. I know that's not. Does that happen to Presbyterian Church? Okay, just want to give you a heads up here. We did some exorcisms in the charismatic Pentecostal movement, and I remember I was both as a member of youth, but also as a youth pastor and a youth teacher at a charismatic church. Is that we would go on these youth retreats and have a lot of exorcisms, particularly for these teenagers. And I remember having a lot of prayer meetings, praying out the demon of lust in teenage kids. Now that I think back, Was there a demon of lust in that 14-year-old boy? Or was he just a 14-year-old boy? In all probability, he was just a 14-year-old boy. What we were dealing with was this belief that demons and devils, and I do believe this, operate on the individual level and work in a negative way on the individual level. But what we failed to recognize because of our lenses was how much demonic activity operates on a social structural level. And that's what Mott is pointing out. That's what Walter Wink, I'm going to reference a little bit later, that's what Walter Wink is pointing out. That sin and evil does not just operate on an individual level, sin and evil also operate on a corporate level. Now, according to Scripture, I do believe that there are demonic powers and principalities. In my charismatic background, we believe that there was a lot of demons that was taking control of a lot of individuals. What got me out of that thinking was just logic, which is if you have a limited number of demons, which the Bible actually says, a limited number of angels, a limited number of demons, would you waste 14 demons on a 14-year-old boy? No, that's really, really a poor use of resources. So if I were Satan and I had the choice, I had 15 demons at my disposal, do I all put it on that 14-year-old boy, or do I say, let's negatively influence the system? Let's not just have one 14-year-old boy with a demon of lust. Let's have the power and principality of lust just rampant throughout our culture. Let's have the power and principality of greed rampant throughout our culture. So that's what Walter Wink is actually pointing towards. That our battle is not against flesh and blood, but it is against powers and principalities, and that these things are much more difficult to address. So one of my favorite movies of all times is The Usual Suspects. If you ever saw that movie, now that I realize, wait, Kevin Spacey starred in, I can't watch it anymore. So you have this movie where the lead character says one of the best lines in the movie, he's quoting somebody actually, he says, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled off was making believe that he doesn't exist. Greatest trick the devil ever pulled off is making people believe that he doesn't exist. I think that's true not just on the individual realm, it is very true on the social structural realm. And so we don't see evil in the social structural realm, and so we can't address sin in its proper geography. So Walter Wink points this out and says that when you see a social system, it's developing through these processes, and it's working through, and it's doing its course of work. And sometimes these social systems are not good, but they're broken, which is what Berger was pointing to. When these social systems are broken, what's allowing these social systems to continue along its dysfunctional way? And that's one of the questions we ask when we talk about injustice. What continues going forward so that these injustices can continue? And we say, let's get a good person to externalize goodness in that broken system, but that person gets eaten up by the system. What continues, what allows these broken systems to continue, what Wink argues, is that there are mediating narratives that allows these broken systems to continue. That's the fuel for the brokenness. So it's not just that these social systems exist, it is also the challenge that these social systems are caught up in these narratives that fuel these social systems. So I'm going to give you one thing, and then we're going to open it up for some question and answer. One of the things that, actually I'll give you two. One of the things that Wink points to is the narrative of the myth and narrative of redemptive violence. That's a very Western concept. So what he argues is that when you have this mythology of redemptive violence, then you can keep up violence because you believe the mythology that violence can be redemptive in the right hands, right? Violence used by the right people means that you can save the system through redemptive violence. But what Wink points out, and others have pointed out, is that violence is not redemptive, violence is violence. And so this myth of redemptive violence allows a people group to continue to act out in violence without addressing this injustice of violence. I'm going to give you a very controversial example. My apologies for those who are going to get offended by this already from the beginning. I am fascinated because my family is from Korea. My father actually is from North Korea. My mom is actually from South Korea. But when they met, there was no such thing as North and South Korea. It was all one country. But I'm fascinated by the rhetoric around North Korea, and especially the the real fear, and I think this is a legitimate fear, that Kim Jong-un has nuclear weapons right now. And I think that's a legitimate fear. But let me give you a little bit of insight in how the rest of the world might view this. I was actually in Seoul, South Korea this summer and talking to some Korean Christians. So how do you feel about this conflict between North Korea and the United States? And I began to talk to others about this. And one of the issues that came up was, who are you really afraid of to handle nuclear weapons? Or any weapons for that matter. So let's use this example. You walk into a room and everybody's got a gun. And you're nervous because they have them out and they're kind of waving it in the air. Are you afraid of the person that's new with the gun? Sure, you should be afraid because they don't know how to use that gun. But I'm also afraid of the one person that abused that gun in the past, that have actually used that gun to kill someone. That's the person I would actually be most afraid of in that room. So I'm saying that nuclear weapons are bad, and it's not good for Kim Jong-un to have nuclear weapons. But the rest of the world is probably more afraid of the one country that has actually used nuclear weapons, more so than the country that just got nuclear weapons, right? Because there is a country that actually used nuclear weapons on human beings and killed many, many people twice. Not just once, but twice. But that's okay if America has nuclear weapons, but not okay when Korea has nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not saying either should have them. I'm just saying that there is a myth of redemptive violence. So violence is okay as long as we control the violence. Then it's redemptive. But if someone else has the means of violence, then that's problematic. But we are good people, therefore we have the right to have weapons of violence as long as we realize that our violence is redemptive, but other people's violence is not redemptive. That's a mythology. And if you just look at it in terms of just logic, people should be most afraid of the person that has abused that weapon in the past, and only one country has ever done that. So how then do we begin to understand how this mythology shapes the culture around us? And that sometimes it's not just the injustice of poverty, but the mediating narrative that informs that injustice. Are you following me here? So we have problems in our system and structure, of course. We have, for example, the problem of a racial disparity in our economics. We have a problem of racial disparity in our incarceration rates. Those are pretty clear injustices that are rooted in a national, it should be considered a national problem, because we have a disparity, economic disparity, incarceration disparity that is based upon race. Now, is the problem the incarceration rates? Of course it is. But is it also the mediating narrative that is fueling these incarceration rates that might be more of the problem? Because let's say overnight, somehow, we do away with all incarceration in America. We do away with mass incarceration. We were able to figure out a solution. But if that mediating narrative that caused mass incarceration in the first place is not dealt with, there will be another social structure that will do the same thing that mass incarceration does. In fact, maybe the best book on this is by Michelle Alexander, who notes that mass incarceration is actually the new Jim Crow. So if you have a narrative that forms a social system that creates the system of slavery, you can do away with slavery, but there will be a new system that takes its place because the mediating narrative is still in play. So you do away with slavery, but you end up with Jim Crow laws. You do away with Jim Crow laws, you end up with a new Jim Crow of mass incarceration. You do away with mass incarceration, if that narrative is still in place, there will be a new dysfunctional social structure in its place that will take over. Because the narrative keeps going along and it'll fuel now a new system rather than the existing system. You can do away with these systems and structures, but at the end of the day, if the narrative is still in play, you will find a new system that operates within that narrative. So, what is the narrative? It's not just racism. I would argue that there is a white supremacy that is fueling these dysfunctions. My next book is actually going to go into a greater detail, so this will give you an incentive when that book comes out next year. I'm co-authoring with a Native American activist, Mark Charles, as a Navajo. We're actually working on this book together because I'm trying to see through his lens as a Native American the ways that white supremacy has harmed him. Now, there's a lot more literature on the way it's harmed African Americans, but this is kind of a different narrative because we're beginning to see a new community that is not kind of victims of race in the traditional sense as African Americans, but are still victims of white supremacy. So I'll give you this kind of one quick thing, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A. But the idea that the mediating narratives maybe hold more power than the systems themselves, and that how do we change the mediating narratives more than, and not just the systems and structures. So a quick example of this. Please believe me, I'm not trying to get political. I'm trying to understand the world which has some politics in it. All right, so that's the distinction. I'm trying to understand the world, and politics is a part of the world. I'm not trying to be political. I'm just trying to understand the world. And one of the things I'm trying to understand about the world is why is it that there are times that people do not operate in their self-interest, but operate out of their mediating narratives? All right, so here's the example. If you look at the latest election, again, I'm not trying to be partisan. I'm not trying to say, rehash the election. I'm just trying to understand it as a social theologian. How do I understand what just happened? And one of the ways I look at it is, it was very strange how much the latest election proved the work of George Lakoff. If any of you read Lakoff's work, he's a communication professor at Berkeley, and he was one of the few academics that actually called the last election. And one of the things he pointed to was that people will not operate out of reason, logic, and self-interest. Their voting patterns are not based upon reason, logic, and self-interest. Here's the way I would explain it. The strongest support for a particular candidate, for Trump, was actually older white men, boomers. If you were a boomer and a white male, in all likelihood, you went in a significant percentage for Donald Trump. The truth is that the rhetoric around the Trump campaign, logically and reasonably, is against self-interest of 65-year-old white men. Here's the reason why. You're a boomer because you're part of the baby boom, right? I mean, that's where the name comes from. Because post-World War II, there was a spike in birth rates. And then there's a next generation, there's a huge drop-off. And that's the baby busters, sometimes called Gen Xers. But you had this spike in birth rates that are the boomers, who are now beginning to retire, 60s, 70s. And then the next generation, 40s and 50s, there's a huge drop-off in terms of numbers, and then it's a slight uptick with the millennials and the Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, that's now in their teens and 20s and some in their 30s. So you're kind of on this kind of curve here. Now, what's happening with the boomers is that you all are retiring in very huge numbers. This is just a basic thing. You're hitting 65, you're retiring. Now, a generation earlier, when Social Security was actually a thing, we had people retiring and dying off at the age of 70, 75, and you were on Social Security for 5 to 10 years. Now, if a person retires at 65, the likelihood is that person will live 10, 20, maybe even 30 years past retirement age. So the boomers that are retiring now are going to have about 20 years of collecting Social Security and pensions. Now, there is no bank of Social Security. The money is not saved somewhere, and the retirees are banking off of that. Where does that money come from? It comes from me. It comes from the Gen Xers. It comes from the millennials. And we are paying Social Security for the retirees. Again, two major problems. One, you have this population boom. And two, you have that generation living 10 years longer, 15 years longer than the previous generation. And three, you've got busters whose population is not large enough to support this growing retirement base. And the millennials with their Starbucks jobs, they're not going to help the economy at all. They're barely making, they're relying on you to pay for their apartments in downtown San Francisco. So what you're ending up with is an economy, according to Dow Myers, this is the work of Dow Myers, that's going to collapse the retirement system is going to collapse in about 10 years. Why? Because you have boomers retiring, and for the next 10, 15 years, trying to draw from Social Security or from retirement from a smaller base of workers and an underemployed base of workers, the money doesn't add up. Unless what? Unless there's money coming into the system that is never ever going to go back out. And who is putting money into the system, but it's not going to take it back out? undocumented immigrants. The latest number, actually a very conservative estimate from the Heritage Foundation, this is not a liberal institution, says that about $7 billion a year is going into Social Security system from undocumented immigrants. That money's going in, it is not coming back out. That's the only way you're going to make up that retirement gap. Again, Gen Xers, there's not enough of us. Millennials, Starbucks jobs, they're not going to have enough income to pay for your Social Security. So if you really are in self-interest mode and really reason and logic this out, you should not be building a wall. You should be delighted that there are undocumented immigrants paying into a system that you're going to benefit from, and they never will, because one estimate is $7 billion, another estimate is $13 billion a year going into the Social Security system and the retirement system. And that is going to save your retirement for the next 10, 20 years. So people are not operating out of self-interest. What Lakoff argues is that they're operating not out of self-interest, but they are operating out of their embodied feelings. That it is an emotional decision more than a logical, reasonable decision. And that is where I say the mediating narratives are so powerful that even if it's in your self-interest to support immigration because it's paying for your retirement, you will not do so because you are operating under the emotional sense of immigrants are bad. Immigrants are going to change America. Immigrants are going to kill our children by driving without licenses. These are all narratives that are out there. These mediating narratives are more powerful than actual logic and reasoning, which says without immigrants, this economy is going to collapse in about 10, 20 years. So mediating narratives are extraordinarily powerful. What I'm asking again is not just address the social structures, but if we go to that slide that shows the circle, what have we internalized from the culture around us that creates a social dysfunction, that creates a theological dysfunction? What have we internalized? What are the mediating narratives that we have brought into our psyche, our emotions, that we have embodied in such a way that we are not operating on the good of what is to come, but we are operating out of fear, anxiety, because these narratives have been internalized. Let me, what's our time check here? Let's open it up for some Q&A for about 5-10 minutes, and then we'll do some small group conversations after that. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what the mic is for.
Thank you so much. This is great stuff, so thank you. One thing is I wanted to ask about, because you're kind of getting to sort of the next place that I've been studying with a group of people, which is, are you familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work around the righteous mind?
Righteous mind, yeah.
Yeah, so I would love to hear your comments on this, because to me the insight that comes through Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory is that myself, a lot of people do not understand how many of us operate from different moral frameworks, which to me that shapes the narrative to start with.
Yes.
And then we don't speak with each other with that understanding of how, you know, whether it's progressive to conservative to whatever. And so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about Haidt's work and how that might be an additional influence on what we might, you know, how we might look at this differently.
Yeah, thank you. And those of you who are familiar, I think he teaches at UVA. Is, I believe, a liberal, politically liberal, who has written a book trying to understand the quote-unquote conservative mind. And the book is called Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T. Check me on that spelling, I think that's right. And what he pointed out was that there are these multiple factors that actually determine whether you are a conservative or liberal politically. Now, without going into the details of it, because it's a pretty significant argument, and there's some good stuff in there. The great thing about what I think he does is to try to understand the other side as well as he can, right? So usually when we're in a conversation, we don't care what the other side is saying. We just want to win the argument. And so what Haidt is trying to do is trying to get the process of thinking from the other side. And I think that's very worthwhile for any of us who are trying to have healthy, productive, difficult conversations, but productive conversations. Try to understand where the other side is coming from. So I think that's one of Haidt's strengths. I think maybe his weakness is that I'm not sure that his categories are comprehensive enough, right? I mean, that's true with any kind of attempt to bring all the categories into one or two. I think he uses 6. It's 6, yeah. So the number of categories that he ends up using, I would say there's probably a little bit more to it than that. But in terms of his attempt to do that, I think it's a very, very important step forward. So I think one of the steps that Haidt gives us is the attempt to try to understand where the other side is coming from, and to say that my arguments that I'm making are not going to necessarily be what convinces the other side. And I have to speak the proper language that's over there. So if I were to go back to this Berger and Luckenbach, I would say different people have internalized different things from society and structures. And to try to convince another person what you've internalized to that other person might not actually work. And I think that's where Haidt is giving us a great challenge. I would say we need to take that a step further to say, what are some other factors that might be shaping a person's social imagination? So I think Haidt is a very important step forward. The other part of that for me is, and we're going to get this when we get to the confrontation piece, is Lakoff's work again. Lakoff points out that most of our language, metaphorical language, is rooted, is shaping of our imagination. So, for example, Lakoff argues that arguments, when we talk about arguments, we use warlike language. He shot down every point that I made. He got very defensive when I made this point. So the language that we use when we talk about arguments tends to be warlike language, which means that when we look at an argument, we see this as a war, as a battle. And therefore, we always have to win, no matter what the truth might be. And you see this in kind of the legal system. I'm not a lawyer, but I watch a lot of TV lawyers. So I love watching Law and Order. And what's the basis of our legal system? Adversarial, right? So you have two sides fighting for their version of truth to be told or to be accepted by the jury. Now, again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just kind of giving some broad strokes here. But the idea of our legal system is an adversarial relationship between the two attorneys. Now, my understanding is, and I think there are a couple of other cultures, there's a couple of Scandinavian countries, there might be a couple of Asian countries, where that adversarial relationship between the two attorneys is not the norm. The goal of other court systems, again, I think Finland might have this system, Sweden might have this system, is both lawyers are in charge of finding out the truth. You're not trying to win the argument, you're trying to get to the truth. And I think that would be a really good lesson for how we engage in justice and how we speak about these issues. Because it's not just winning the argument, which again, Lakoff argues is the language we use around arguments. It's not a war that you have to win. Everybody loses, everybody wins. Well, one side wins, one side loses. But if your goal is to find the truth, then both sides will win, because hopefully you'll find the truth. By the way, this is what I teach them when I do my evangelism class. Because the old way of doing evangelism was, here is the truth that I have. I got it all written down in 4 points, or 3 points. And I need to convince you, through my evidence, that I'm right and you're wrong. And the goal here is for you to agree to my 4 propositions. That's what evangelism has usually been over the last 50 plus years, kind of a very modern approach to evangelism. What if we were to say to a non-believer or someone who is seeking, all right, I've got some ideas, but at the end of the day, we're just going to pursue truth together. We're going to study Scripture, and I'm not going to teach it to you. We're just going to go and say we want to learn the truth through Scripture, and we'll see where this leads us. Now, I'm naive enough to think that the Scripture is true enough that at the end of that process, that person will be introduced to who Jesus is. Because I believe that Scripture is able to do that. Versus, here is my understanding of truth, and I'm going to dump it on you, and you just have to sign off on it. That leads to pretty weak discipleship. Because now you've learned everything you needed to know. You don't need to ever grow ever again. You just got those 4 spiritual laws in place. Versus, our journey is to find truth together. And is that also a way we pursue justice? Our journey is to pursue justice, God's justice together. I have a version of it, you have a version of it, but we're going to actually say our journey together is to find that truth. And maybe that's what Haidt is kind of pointing towards as well, the process of that journey. 1 or 2 more questions. So you agree with everything I've said. That's awesome. Thank you.
We've just finished reading Lamentations.
All right.
Not a very much fun subject for any of us.
You're welcome.
And I would contend a theme in Lamentations is, we've sinned, we deserve this. And I would say, is that a mediating narrative of the Old Testament versus the New Testament, which says, your sins are forgiven, only believe?
Wow, that's great. This is where it's so good to read the Old and the New Testament together. And this is where, some of the scholars now are beginning to recognize this kind of artificial division, that this is all one big revelation. So if we combine those two revelations, yes, of course, we've sinned and continue to fall short of the glory of God. Of course, we continue to not meet the standards that the law has set out for us. That's a very clear Old Testament message. It's also a New Testament message. And the New Testament message also says, but even despite your brokenness, your sinfulness, there is still hope in the person of Christ. So that's why the whole narrative has to kind of fit together. And so I would say that maybe part of our challenge in this is understanding the more complete version of the mediating narrative rather than kind of bits and pieces of it. I don't think I'm going to get to it tomorrow. I was looking over my notes, realized my sermon is going to go about 2 hours if I cover everything I wanted to cover tomorrow. But I'll give you this insight that I think it's in this book, but if you look at Next Evangelicals, my first book, it has a little more of a debate of a description of this. And that's the difference between the way we understand shalom in the Hebrew word and the word peace in the American word, right? Peace in the American word is what? The absence of war. That's usually the way we define peace in the American English way of understanding peace. So where are we now? Well, we're at a time of peace because we're not in a war. That's usually the way we understand peace. Peace is then usually the translation of the Hebrew word shalom. And so we think the word shalom is the equivalent of the English word peace in the American usage. And of course it's not, because it's a Hebrew word. And the word shalom, the way it's used throughout the Old Testament and in the New Testament, is not the absence of war, it is the fullness of God's presence, which is very different, right? So in the fullness of God's presence then, you are not just encountering God when all the conflict and all the pain is gone, you still can find God in the midst of pain, right? Do you see the difference? So if peace is the absence of war, absence of pain, absence of struggle, absence of lament, then of course that's what you're looking for, and that's the end goal. But if you understand peace from the shalom piece of it, then it's actually not just the presence of victory and triumph and celebration, but it is also the presence of suffering and pain and lament. And therefore, we don't discount the narrative of the Old Testament, which says there is sin, there is brokenness, there is a fallenness, but we also integrate that with the stories of hope that we see in the New Testament. So how do we do the both and of it that shalom seems to point towards? All right, maybe one more question? Let's do this then. We'll about 5-10 minutes, and then you can take your break after you do that small group time, and then we'll come back together at 3:15. So about 5-10 minutes of conversation, and then you can take your break as you're talking. But please, with about 3 or 4 people around you, especially if you come with these people, ask yourself, what are the mediating narratives in your community? What are the narratives that you see as contributing or fueling the injustices in the world around us? So I'm not asking you, okay, there's a problem of mass incarceration, there's a problem of treatment of immigration, but what's the narrative behind that? What's the social imagination, the metaphors, the meta-narratives that are fueling these social injustices? So just with the 4 or 5 people around you, take about 5 minutes to do that, then transition to a break, and we'll come back together at 3:15.